2, 1. Cambridge Insider Podcast time. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the #1 trending podcast in F1 high school international education in the US, I believe. I'm not 100% sure. Co-host Leanna, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. That is quite a mouthful that you have for our introduction, and I'm impressed every time you say it, and I don't think I'll ever get the order of those words correct.
If you ask me to do it in five minutes time, I won't even get the order correct. So that's where we are right now. How does it feel to be back for episode 2 co-hosting this podcast?
It feels good. I'm still pretty nervous. So I'm probably not supposed to say that. I'm supposed to be a very confident podcast host, co-host, which I am, but it's a new thing for me. So I still have the butterflies, but it's actually a good feeling to be doing something that's challenging and new.
Awesome. Well, we love having you here. I know the listeners feel the same. I know executive producer Dean feels the same as well. And you know what? We're just going to keep putting great content out there. Nobody else is doing this in the industry. We're breaking new ground. That's what Cambridge Network is all about. If your agency that you work with doesn't do this, maybe you need to ask why. All right, moving on from that subtle little dig. Exciting episode because I think Cambridge had an awesome opportunity this week. Myself specifically, not that it was anything to do with me, but the organization Cambridge Network had the great opportunity to present at the NAIS. I believe it's a quarterly webinar conference, call it what you will. And we were asked to be one of the guest speakers. NAIS, for those of you that don't know, I'm going to get it right, the National Association of Independent Schools. So many of the schools that would be listening to this podcast, I know some of you did see me say a couple words there. And for those of you that maybe aren't part of NAIS, it was a great opportunity for us to share a little bit of insight from our perspective, and all around just a really, really cool experience.
Yeah, I actually looked into NAIS after you told me you had this great opportunity, and it seems like a really great asset for schools. So if you don't know much about it, definitely recommend looking into it. Stephen, if you could tell us and our listeners a little bit about what topics you covered, and what you talked about in this presentation, I think we'd all love to hear.
Absolutely. I think they initially approached us, and it was actually a school official that we work really closely with, that one of our CEM partners, which is awesome, that connected me with NAIS, and they were looking for speakers to speak specifically to the international market in 2021. Where are we? How are things looking? And hopefully inform their schools a little bit about the context of the industry, but also specifically from Cambridge's side, one of the things that we try to do was to provide them with some solutions. So typically, it was a 20-minute speaking gig. I hope I painted a picture of where the market is at this stage for them, which we've delved into several times on this podcast, understanding that the most important thing to remember there is that it's an incredibly competitive market for recruitment of international students, specifically those coming from Southeast Asia. Looking specifically at how did it become such a competitive market? Yes, COVID-19 played a big role in accelerating some of the trends that we were seeing in the market, but looking at some of the other factors that made the market into what it is today, understanding that there's competition outside of the USA, understanding that recent narrative about international education and about immigrants and about certain populations haven't been productive for this industry. And on top of that, we've had to deal with the pandemic. And then at the end of that, we were fortunately, I hope, able to sort of give schools that were listening a little bit of a strategy, given the context of the market, given that it's so competitive and difficult. What can we do? What's within our control that we can move with as a school partner to try and salvage and to try and rebuild our program? So, we hope we gave them some good information.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure you did. And I definitely want to get to those solutions that you talked about for our school partners. And I just want to highlight the fact that understanding where we are in the market, understanding how we got to this point, understanding our challenges and our barriers, that's so important in creating those solutions. So I think it's so important for our schools to have an understanding of that. First, tell us about some of the school's feedback or questions you fielded during this presentation.
Absolutely. And just before I answer that, Leanna, I love what you said there, because I think there's a little bit of a misconception around the industry that COVID happened and we are where we are. And sometimes that'll give an attitude or leave schools with the idea that, oh, once COVID fades, we'll be back to normal. And something that we at Cambridge Network often speak about, that yes, COVID had devastating effects on the industry, but there are other factors at play, and those factors are really telling us that we need to address the change in this industry. So I think that, I love what you said there. So in terms of what schools, I think the feedback overall was good. We fielded several questions towards the end of the presentation, which is always great because I think people are willing to engage. I think the international education industry still holds a very special place for a lot of schools. I think they look to it for diversity. I think they believe in international education, as we do at Cambridge Network, and you and I do, hosting this podcast. So there was a lot of engagement, which I love, because I think that's going to allow us as schools and as agencies to come up with solutions. I will say, however, I think some of the questions that we fielded probably illustrated a little bit of the challenge that we've been seeing with a lot of our interactions as well, is that schools, I think, still view international education, specifically the admissions, the marketing, and the recruitment side of things, as it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, what I call the golden age of the industry. We were flush with students, and there was a certain way of thinking about this industry. And I think I could probably see that, and maybe I'm being a little pessimistic here, but I could probably see that come through in some of the questions. And I think it is so important that schools acknowledge that this industry has changed, but also acknowledge that we do have strategies and solutions to overcome that change. We have to adapt if we want to continue offering quality services and want to continue growing our international programs. But it really is that first step, is really changing the way in which we think about it. And I know that can be difficult. Anybody that's done something for several years and then it's asked to change, it's a little bit of human nature to try and hold on to what we know and what's worked well in the past.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, but I agree. It might take some time, and some education through presentations such as the one you just gave, but understanding in reality really where we stand in the market and in the industry will help schools. And I love what you said about international programs and what they add to a school community. I think, it just can't be said enough what having an international and diverse student population will give to those students studying abroad, but also your students, your domestic students, and the things they'll learn from that cultural exchange, the things your teachers will learn from teaching students from another culture, just unending value there. So let's talk about some of the solutions that you did go over with these schools in understanding the challenges and where we are right now. What were some of the solutions talked about?
Absolutely. I think, the big takeaway and the big conversation that we're having across our network with many of our school partners is to, I think, first and foremost, understand that excellent student experience is imperative in this market. And if you cannot produce excellent, exceptional student experience across the board, whether that be in your homestay, in the classroom, out on the fields, just in your general engagement with your students, very likely, because of the competitiveness of this market, you will lose out to a school down the road, to a school on another coast, to a school in the middle of America, or to a school in Canada, Australia, the UK. So exceptional student experience is incredibly important, and making sure that every touch point, for lack of a better word, that a student has with your institution, with your school, needs to be exceptional. We were in a situation a couple of years ago, and that's just where the market was, that schools held the power in the relationship. And I don't want to go too philosophical in it, but that's the reality of where it was. Whereas now, with the advent of increased internet availability, specifically in China, but in Southeast Asia, students and families and agents have access to information. And with that access to information comes the power to be able to decipher programs, to be able to evaluate programs, and ultimately to be able to find other programs as well. So understanding that every time you have a touch point, every time you connect with a student, wherever that might be, make sure that it's exceptional, because that student will go away and that student will hopefully speak very positively about your program, and that in turn will lead in the long term to that sort of self-sustaining marketing process where you have students that are loyal to your product, loyal to your school, and that are advocating for your school. So that, I think, was the first takeaway. I think the second one, and one that we've spoken about in depth for several times on this podcast specifically, is schools understanding that they need to invest into their international programs, into their international admissions, marketing, and recruitment processes, just as they've done domestically. And I say just as they've done domestically because I am trying to impart on schools and on school partners the fact that this is not a wild idea that we're coming up with. The majority of schools that I speak to have a rather large domestic marketing and recruitment and admissions budget that they are willing to spend on recruiting students that come to their schools. And they need to be approaching international education and international marketing and recruitment in the same way. You have to be willing to invest in that recruitment, invest in that marketing, make sure that you are getting into the living rooms, onto the cell phones, onto the computer screens of your target market, because that is the thing in this incredibly competitive market that will help you be seen in this incredibly competitive pool of great programs across the country. So those are really the two big takeaways that that we and strategies that we helped schools understand. And hopefully some of them will heed the advice, and I firmly believe that some won't, because they might not just be quite there yet. But I think it's strong advice, and we've seen the evidence roll in that these are two things that are really important for them to be aware of.
Definitely. And I think if I were a school listening to your talk today, I would walk away understanding that my program needs to adapt to these ever-changing circumstances. We need to invest in our programs and evolve where we should, depending on the circumstances at our school and the circumstances that come about from COVID in the next 6 months. Flexibility, I think, is key. And then that we need to stand out and we need to have excellent services. And is that, so are those takeaways kind of what you would hope a school would walk away with today?
Absolutely. Even just, for those of you that weren't, obviously not everybody was on that NAIS webinar, but yeah, absolutely. Understanding those two key points, understanding that, when we talk about change, and we often like to, again, go back to COVID, but what COVID-19 proved to us in the industry specifically, and when it comes to recruitment of students, is that the agency model, which again, I continue to say is still very prevalent. We're certainly not hiding our head in the sand and saying that it's not there anymore. The agency model and utilizing agency relationships to recruit students for our schools is still very much there. But what COVID-19 did within a matter of days was take away that physical contact, take away that ability to travel, take away that ability to go to an agent, to educate them on a school, to present a school to them. And that forced us to think a little bit outside of the box. And there are a lot of other factors that play into that. But that is certainly not the only way to reach families and to market and to showcase the great program that you have. There are other ways, and you really need to be thinking about that. If you need proof that social media and making sure that you're on the right platforms is the way to go, take public transport and see how many people are talking to one another versus on their screens. And that should be evidence enough.
Yeah, and I love what you said also about leaving an impact on students and their families at every touch point with the school. I think that's so important. I mean, what could be more powerful than word of mouth, with a mother saying to another mother or a friend saying to their friend, I had an amazing experience at my high school. You should really look it up. And here's what organizations I was involved in. And here's my favorite teacher. And this is how they impacted me. That type of word of mouth advocacy for a school will go so far.
100%. And it's, sometimes when we do interview people on this podcast, we've interviewed you prior to your rise to fame as being the co-host, and several other people that are in the support side of things, specifically on the ground. The value that we can put on that, and the value that school programs should put on those support services and the agencies that they connect with and that they partner with is so important, because it's an extension of your program. If Leanna Glass is doing a great job on the ground with students, your school is doing a great job, and the opposite also certainly does is also true as well. So Leanna, we've come to probably to the end of the podcast. I'm going to step in and I don't want to say save both of us, but typically I would end the podcast and I would say, do you have any final thoughts? But seeing as you asked so many questions, I don't know if you want to ask it. I don't know.
You know what? I was going to do that. And then I said to myself, maybe Stephen will get a little offended if I jump in here and ask him final thoughts, but I'm happy you brought this up. So Stephen, what are your final thoughts before we say goodbye today?
You do understand that with that question, you will also be the one signing off and saying goodbye to all of our listeners. I'm just saying with it's great responsibility. Our listeners take it very seriously. My final thoughts are, awesome privilege and a great opportunity for us to connect with schools and like-minded individuals at the NAIS conference. Again, to the school official that introduced me, she knows who she is. I'm not going to mention names. Thank you, because I think it's important that we put information out there and that we educate people on this market. To schools, certainly don't be an ostrich. Don't hide your head in the sand. Understand that this is a changing market. Understand that there are strategies, however, that we can use to combat this. And as always, Cambridge Network is here to support you and to help you. So those are my final thoughts.
Thank you so much. All right, then I guess it's my time to shine. We are signing off. Thank you so much to all of our listeners, and we will catch you on the next podcast. See you soon.
Bye-bye, everybody.